Thank you everyone for joining us, and welcome to UCLA TDG's webinar on software, ownership, licensing, and open source. I should tell you who I am. I'm Dina Lozofsky. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development for Physical Sciences and Engineering at UCLA's Technology Development Group, which is essentially the tech transfer office at UCLA. And we're really excited to bring this information to you because as we all know, software is starting to pervade everything. And in the spirit of constant improvement, we have been working really hard to make our processes, practices, licenses around software better and much easier for all of you to use and engage with us. So Angie, if you could flip the slide, please. As part of that, we've also updated our website of FAQs. We've tried to expand the information, make it a little bit easier to digest around copyright and software, and then also have opened up a new one around open source and other software sharing. Hopefully that will get the conversation going, help you look for resources when you need them. We've also started to have 2 new dedicated email boxes around those 2 topics, a copyright at tdg.ucla and a software at tdg.ucla. And just in case you're worried that those email boxes go to a black hole, absolutely they do not. The copyright mailbox goes directly to Angie Kujak, our Senior Director of Contracts, and the software at TDG one goes to Joel Cayley, Business Development Officer, who is responsible for our software portfolio. Next slide, please. And just to give you all an idea of how we're going to structure the webinar today, we have 3 separate segments, each around 10 to 15 minutes. We'll address questions as we can throughout, whatever we have time for. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box. If we have time at the end, we'll address more of them at the end as well. And I want you all to know this is really a dialogue that we're trying to start with you. If you see other areas of improvements, if you see licenses that you think would be helpful that we don't have yet, we'd very much like to hear from you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Angie to talk about ownership.
Great, thanks, Dina. So first, just to start out, to get buy-in from the audience, why is TDG investing time and energy in augmenting its tools and making them better and establishing processes? Well, this graph is a great visual of why. This was recently published by the US Patent Office, looking at where software, and particularly here, AI technologies, we're moving into. And we're seeing software pop up, as Dina referenced, in portfolios that are not traditionally comp sci, computer science. So normally, most computer science or software disclosures come to Joel, but now we're seeing them pop up across the team. And so it was more important than ever to establish processes for identifying these IP assets, establishing processes for intake of those, proper intake, and then streamlining our licensing of those assets. And then in particular, I just wanted to highlight with LA, the PTO also put out this map. And I think what was interesting is we're getting a lot of clustering in LA. I know Dina, Joel, and I are all talking about this at the ground level, but this map did a really nice job of reflecting as what we're feeling. Like this is really going to start booming. And why might that be, just generally, whether in California or elsewhere? Well, more and more people know how to code than ever before. Kids, I have 2 children. One of them is taking like 3 different coding clubs, where she's learning how to code. So I think we're going to find more and more that everyone knows somebody that codes if they don't know themselves. And it's becoming a natural integration into a researcher's project. When they're looking for a solution and they want a particular tool, they more naturally reach out for that software tool, and it's more likely to be available, whether via open source or otherwise. There's just so much more available to researchers today. So we're finding more and more integration into spaces, even therapeutics, outside of your traditional, again, software space. And finally, just computing power being cheaper. It's just cheaper, faster to get stronger computers. So there's going to be more and more researchers bringing in data into their, and software into their technology to help make them easier, cheaper, stronger, faster. So I can just take an example of, we have someone on campus that works on microscopes and is removing pieces and parts of it to make it easier and relying on software instead. And I'll provide that example at the end, but this is where we see it happening, where there's this cross-functionality, where inventions are being improved that are based on software. And that just elevates the importance of software, just like with artificial intelligence being more valuable, just more eyes on trying to get that out of the university and into a startup company, more interest. So first, just at a very high level, what rights can you have in software? And it depends, but none of these are in isolation. You know, ideally, you have a couple of these present, and you probably do, but just starting out with copyright, you inherently have copyright rights in software nearly always. And you don't even need to mark your software with a copyright to have that sort of right in it. They're cheap, even to register. So I think it's $35 still, but enforceability can be a challenge. You know, are you really going to go to court and spend those resources to enforce? So that's where you might look at patents. Maybe you have software that requires a lot of investment upfront to develop it, and you need to protect that investment. That's where a patent might be very useful. But they are not only time intensive, but also cost a lot of money to get through the patent office. And it's more challenging than ever to get patents on software. But again, in those cross-functional, those where you have hardware and software, that is where maybe perhaps it will be much easier for you to get a patent, and it might be worth it, worth the time and the money to get a patent, because you're going to try to protect that initial investment in the technology. And then finally, trade secret. So the trick with trade secrets is you have to keep it secret. So if you're distributing your software, that's a real challenging thing to do. But maybe your business model is providing services, so you don't have to distribute the software, but rather people access your software in a cloud or elsewhere where you don't have to distribute it. Maybe that's where something like a trade secret strategy will work. Universities, it's more difficult, of course, but there are ways that we can work with faculty to discuss these types of strategies when we look at the software as a whole. So no one size fits all. We kind of look at each piece of software that comes in and think about whether it's worth patenting or whether we can just simply rely on copyright and or trade secret. But again, as a university, that's very difficult. So who are the different players in a piece of software that gets disclosed to us? A lot of time and effort gets spent on ownership. Do I own it, or does the university own it? And that is a very important question. However, I think it's also very easily resolved by papering it. I think, if you're going to take the risk of taking something off campus and investing dollars and resources in it, why not just ensure that you have ownership, whether it starts with a conversation and we clear it, or we simply out-license it. So I think a lot of time and energy gets spent on ownership where it can actually be resolved quite quickly. The more challenging question is actually the full scope of authorship or contributors, and making sure that we have assignments from all of those authors, or at least everyone who touched the code and contributed, and then just distinguishing between a true author versus a contributor, where that line is a little blurred. How substantial was their contribution? And that is yet different from inventorship on a patent. So inventorship under patent is defined by patent law on a patent, where copyright and authorship is defined under copyright laws, and those don't overlap cleanly, with authorship and contributors being more broad than inventorship. And then finally, the steward. Who is the steward of the software? And that can also be important. Maybe it's an agreement you come up and you and your colleagues come up with in a plan in advance. Who is going to be the point person on the code? Who's going to coordinate all of the contributions and ensure that the integrity of the code is kept in a central location? And so there are something else to think about for faculty members who are listening and are researchers is students. If you're going to have student participants and they're getting access to a unique project and they're tracking down and making sure you're getting assignments proper here, and please reach out to Joel, and you can use that software email address, software@tdg.ucla.edu. And he can help answer these questions. We can put something in place up front so that we don't find ourselves 3 years later really hoping we can commercialize something and tracking down every contributor or author is proving too difficult. So UC ownership, when does UCLA own the software created by its faculty or researchers? It depends. I wish I could provide you this clear, bright line rule, but there's a number of factors. Most of the time, UC's ownership comes through some sort of agreement that was put in place that the software was created under. For example, federal funds. If federal funding was involved, more than likely that federal grant is defining who owns it, how you have to make it available, and who, meaning UCLA, has to fulfill that obligation to make it available, or a foundation agreement, or a sponsor who's being granted rights to all copyrightable materials produced in the performance of the research. So all of those factors often tip the hand to say, well, probably UCLA owns this because it has a contractual obligation to someone else. Also, just use of university resources, including having access to either your own research in your lab or those of others, and where you wouldn't have been able to make that software or have those ideas, but for having access to some proprietary or university resources. And finally, there's policy. And that is, a complicated question. It depends again on the facts. And just please reach out to us and we'll step through it with you based on the facts of your particular software. So just to give a little insight into how we process it at TDG, we look at all of these factors, these little balls that we can kind of funnel through to see if we can commercialize it, all these questions that we ask ourselves. Who are the contributors? Does it link to any external libraries? And if it does, can we rectify that or figure out a way for the licensee to get access to that library? Are there any third-party obligations that remain unfulfilled, or did we cross and check those boxes off? Also, big one that's growing is data use. Did you use data from someone else when training your algorithm and improving your software code? Often the person providing data, and I saw one of these just today, where someone's providing data from another university and they're placing conditions on the software created from that data, or even the modified versions of that data. So just something to think about, that you may not even see it in the code any longer. It's the questions you have to ask. And this is from tech transfer perspective, questions that you just need to do more diligence than your traditional invention disclosure, where we're all very used to a particular invention disclosure form. We're used to asking about inventorship, and we are used to funding, but other things like open source code. Did they incorporate open source code, Or similar to my next slide, did they really? Go ahead.
Sorry, I think this might be a good time to answer one of the questions. We've been asked, can you please comment on and provide some clarity on authorship as it relates to the designer of functionality and making the flowchart, architecting, perhaps by a non-coder, versus the person who writes the code in Python or whatever the language is?
Yeah, so we've had this question come up a couple times now, and we really had to dig into it a bit and look at the contribution. And it really comes to, did they provide a creative contribution? We're really looking at, under copyright law, how creative was that contribution? How much did it provide to that functionality? But also just thinking, similar to data being annotated, was it just a mere pair of hands, or was it something more than that? Were they providing some intellectual contribution? And so, again, I wish I could provide a bright line rule, but it really depends on the overall structure in the software itself, if it was a major component that enabled the software to work for its intended use. Great. So the last slide I kind of showed where we talk about what's in the software. This next slide, you also have to consider where the software went. Did they share it with anyone without terms? Did they share it, release it in open source, under an open source license? And then how can you make your life easier? So this is something we did recently at TDG with all of those prior questions, because it's a lot. And the time to get that information is when they're disclosing to you, because often the licensing is not happening for 2 or 3 years later. And it's much more difficult to track down all those individuals and ask those questions, and in the memories of those individuals too, they're just farther away from it. So we've established a separate software invention disclosure form for them to fill out, and it asks the appropriate questions that aren't asked in your traditional invention disclosure form. And at the end, we've attached an assignment form so the researcher can more easily quick grab everybody in their lab who's there on, at that time and get their signature.
Angie, that was great. Thank you. Sorry, Dina, go ahead.
I was just going to give it a moment, questions on ownership. There've been some questions that are going to be addressed in this next section on open source and other sharing licenses. I was just going to give it a moment. All right, with that, Joel, just so you know, the questions we've been getting are going to be, have all been around this kind of sharing. So please go ahead and tell people how we're moving to better solutions for that.
Great, thank you. Angie, can I have the first or the next slide, please? Great. So I think the biggest takeaway from this slide is that there is a potential range of software licenses that would meet a range of needs. So on the left, you have commercial licenses, and those are good for some, but not all scenarios. On the far right, you have open source, and that's also good for some, but not all scenarios. So what we are doing is we're creating licenses in this middle ground, which are appropriate for academic use or for limited commercial use. And I'll say more about that in the next slides. So probably, excuse me, the first question or the first thing to discuss is why wouldn't you want to use open source? So whether it's a commercial license or an open source license, they're both very all or nothing. And so there are cases where maybe you're not quite sure what you want to do with the code yet. Maybe you want to share it with a small group of people. Maybe you want those rights to expire. Maybe it's possible, but you don't know yet, that there would be a patent associated with your software. So there are a few reasons where neither a commercial license or an open source license are appropriate. And we've discovered this by working with different PIs and listening to their use cases. And after a while, we saw a few patterns pop up. Next slide, please. So the three that we've started with, even though there are surely more, are these options where you have an academic sharing and the person, the individual or the lab that you're sharing with has the right to create a derivative work and then distribute that derivative work. So that's a use case that we're seeing. But it's for whatever reason, either it's the desire of the researcher or there's an obligation because of funding attached to it, the software needs to be shared in a non-commercial fashion. Also, we are seeing a situation where you want to share with another researcher and they can create a derivative work, but they're not allowed to reshare it. And you can think of this as the way to grant access to someone who might need to modify your software and you just don't have the resources in your lab to be helping them fix bugs. Maybe they need to add a new feature for their particular area of research. Maybe they're working on different hardware and so they need to change something in a library. And you're happy to let them do that, but you're not a software shop. You don't want to be in the business of supporting your software for other researchers. So it's here, you have this, you can play with it, and you can't distribute it though. And then the last that we've seen, the last use case that we're seeing is useful is this short-term commercial evaluation. And so if there's a company that might be interested in your software or might be interested in doing industry-sponsored research at your lab, for whatever reason they want to look at the software, we've created this license which lets them evaluate it for a very short period of time, for, well, 60 days. So it's enough time that they can understand what they might want to do with the software. So next slide, please. So to help people understand which of these use cases to use, we have created this self-service software license picker. And these are the three cases which I've just described. So the first one in red is, researchers can modify the code and they can share it. And if you'll note, the click here, which is underlined, which you'll see on our website, will actually take you to that license. And so the beauty of this for you is that it's self-serve. You cut, you paste, you do very small modifications, and off you go.
Joel,
so the next use case.
Apologies, I'm going to interrupt you with a couple of questions. So there was a question about where the link is to see these agreements.
So can you see my mouse? I don't know whether people can see my mouse on the screen or not.
No, it's Angie's mouse.
Got it. So in the red section, thank you, Angie, where Angie is looking where it says click here and that underline, you can see that URL. So in our FAQ section, we have all of these licenses on a single page that people can cut and paste from. And it's pretty easy to find on the website. If you have any difficulties, you can let me know and I can mail you the link. So that's very easy to do.
Thank you. And then also there was a question in the first two types of licenses. Are you reserving the right to commercialize, and how does that affect contributions made by others?
So we are reserving the right to commercialize, and I'm actually going to ask Angie to comment on how that would affect a contribution made by a third party. I have some thoughts on that, but Angie, can you comment on that?
Sure. So I moved it ahead to the slide that reflects the academic to academic with the right to transfer. And before I answer that question, I will say we get a lot of these questions from researchers, and it's always like on a Friday afternoon, and they're in a hurry, and they just want to do something, get it out to their friends, their colleagues, to quick have them check it out, to help them because they're working on a publication. What can I put into it yet not damage my patent rights? And this is what we're sending to them. We really did have a use case for this, and we're using this, and it's making a lot of researchers happy. Going to the question, so we don't ask for a copy back of the derivative work made by that subsequent recipient. Now we can, so if there's a researcher out there that says, like, I want to receive derivative works made by the subsequent researcher, or you want to limit or discuss that item if that's important to you. This version is really meant for, I'm going to put this paragraph in and I'm going to send it to a few colleagues that I know well. They're going to do a specific thing for me. And I really don't care if they make derivative works and go off and with it and running that. I want them to eventually too. Whatever the scenario is, we can address it. So if that is a concern, if you would want to limit and talk about what credit needs to be given either to the person who contributes or to you as the original author, we can discuss that and come up with a version that controls for that.
Thank you, Angie. And I'm sorry, Joel.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Angie just addressed the next question, which was, does UCLA allow for negotiation of these templates, or are they take it or leave it? And the concept here for us is that we wanted to make some of this self-service, as Angie was talking about, so that if it's late at night or Friday, or is something that needs to be addressed super quickly for some reason, you have an option to go with these. If something is more complicated, if you have questions, if it's not exactly right for the situation that you're trying to address, we just wanted to make something sort of simple and self-service. And Angie, maybe somebody asked what we think of the Polyform project licenses. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so she's the one who, so the author of those, and her name is escaping me at this moment. She's fantastic. And so we had a lively discussion maybe a year ago on this topic. And I said, we really needed, a solution for academic to academic. And if you go to her website, she has a really cool tool as well. And I do see more and more people pausing with open source. I'm not saying open source is not a good solution, because it is the perfect solution for so many things. It's the reason why researchers are integrating software, because there's so much open source available to them. So it's no diminishment of open source and the value it can provide. But there are cases where there's a need for more control. And we were thinking about this prior to us being exposed to that polyform. And like, oh, great, someone else is feeling consistent with us, and this is an okay thing to consider. Her website, which we can provide in the notes maybe after, is terrific. Yes, the Polyform Project.
And Jeff Jackson is kind enough to say that it's Heather Meeker.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I'm going to say she's in the San Francisco area, and she's a terrific attorney and specializes in this space.
Fabulous. And we've had a question about open source, which we'll get to in a moment. I think you answered ownership of derivative works. I don't know if one of the two of you wanted to mention that.
It's going to be a non-unsatisfactory answer, but the derivative works, we've looked at this many times. Like, when does particularly with licensees, because we're sending out our original code and they want to know when a derivative work is so derivative that it's no longer the original work and they can stop paying us royalties. It's complicated. And so you really look at the percentages, and it's a number of things that you look at, but largely we think of like how we eventually decide, okay, when you get to version 10, that's when we cut royalties, or when we get to 20 years. It's almost better to define it that way. If you're thinking from a licensing perspective, like how long do you pay royalties and have the right to grab, consideration. It's almost better to speak in terms of time or versions rather than necessarily percentages and really diving in to see if it's truly a derivative work. The other question, like derivative work and authorship, is more complicated and not something I don't think we can answer on this call, and it depends on the code.
Thank you. Joel, let's get back to your presentation.
Excellent. Those are, excuse me, those are great questions. Yeah, let's back up to this one. So we'd already talked about the academic ability to modify. Let's see, actually, Angie, do you want to just back up really quickly? I want to go over the, yeah, just this is what you'll see. This is the first question in the license picker, and we cover academic with derivative works that can be shared, academic with derivative works that cannot be shared, and then the limited time commercial sharing for evaluation purposes. And so this is the language. It's not color coded, but this is the language on the website. Next slide, please. So the next question on the picker is, if you need to publish to a journal, and the journal has open source licensing requirements, we have a BSD license that we use, and again, we have the example code for that available for people to modify. Next slide, please. So this is an example, and Angie had pulled this up earlier, and I think it's worth pointing out that this is basically a modification of the BSD license, where what we've done is we've just limited the scope. So if the open source license was broader, we have limited the scope for nonprofit and academic researchers. And so these are very modest changes to make it suitable for this research license. And when you're cutting and pasting this license, of course, if you're sending out open source, you can put this in a header that it's available in your code. And then the highlighted areas, you want to change the copyright. If you've been working on this for a few years, go ahead and put the range of years in. Otherwise, if it's during the current year, just put that year in. And then if there's someone in your lab that you want to be contacted, you can put in that email address. personally, I recommend that people use a organizational email. So if there's someone who's in your lab one quarter and they're not in the lab the next quarter, it still will reach one or more people in the lab. And then alternatively, you can just have them email software@TDG, which will go to me. Next slide, please.
So thank you, Joe. Oh, sorry. Did you want to have a couple more comments?
No, it's all. I was going to ask you if there were any more questions we should address right now.
There are. So someone asked what the difference is between BSD and BSD3.
So the BSD is actually a set of licenses, and there is the 3-clause license in there and the 2-clause license. The 3-clause license prohibits someone who is using the software from using the original creators as part of their promotional material. And so the BSD license that we use, and she stopped me if this isn't correct, but obviously the UC doesn't allow people without express permission to use UCLA as promotion. So we use a license where that's not allowed.
Correct, yeah.
So there are several more questions on BSD and open source. And what I'm going to do to keep us moving is suggest that we address those at the end of the program. I did want to mention that we are happy to make the slides available, and a video of this webinar will be available on TDG's YouTube channel once we've done a little bit of post-production on it. So with that, Angie, there's one question from earlier that I missed. There was a question on if data from another investigator was used in improving the software code, does that affect ownership? And I thought you might want to address that as you move into commercial licensing.
Great, yes, and I will. Thanks. And that's a big topic right now among universities. I'm part of a little working group who's looking at how to simplify the data transferred among universities and making very clear what those terms are. And just a quick answer to that question, it really depends on the terms that you receive that data under. I know the example I referenced today was from an overseas university who had an agreement. It was a short form, but it did expressly state, here are the terms for using our data. So it really depends. And I know a lot of universities who are receiving disclosures are struggling with that question because they don't know for sure what all of the terms are. And frankly, that's why transferring software is so important to do with terms, and why it's a great opening to commercial licensing. Why might you want to license from a university? And a big part of it is to make sure that when it's time to do your due diligence clearance as a startup or a company, if you're from the company side, that you have the diligence in place. A lot of time is spent doing fiduciary and different review of all of documents and all of the software and saying, did they have the right to use this data? Did they have the right to use this software? And it's probably worth just doing that little bit of work up front, which is at the time or closer at least to the time the software was created, to paper that. And so that might be a big push, a reason to do a license with the university. Just if you're looking to take code from inside the university and out, paper it, because then you're going to make your attorney happy and you're going to save yourself a lot of money later when your attorney has to go back and correct or fix or untangle something. Also, patents. It may be the type of software, as we discussed at the beginning, the type of technology that requires substantial investment, where patents are worth the time and expense. And so taking a license and ensuring you have actual ownership, or at least full license and clear title transfer from the university, not that they're getting ownership, but that the university owns whatever it is it's out licensing, and that you have exclusive rights. Exclusive rights can be really important when that investment is substantial and it's relying solely on that particular software or technology. It's much less important when it's just a side piece and it's an extension of a piece of hardware. And that's the second bullet. So often what we see is it's a primary invention that also has a software aspect to it. And when that occurs, it's much more likely that the university owns that bit of software, and you're better off just getting it bundled in to the license agreement and treating it all at once. That way you had the right to take it and to create derivative work, then go off and commercialize. And why might you want that software? Well, a lot of times they're using it just even to raise that initial investment, to show the investors in real time, here's what our software is, the goal is, and we can show you this not perfect version that's not up to scale or up to industry standards, but we can show you what we're going for here for our company. So it can be a great value in those early years to get off the road and running, and also to save yourself development time, because everything in this space moves so quickly. And that's sort of the downside of patents, where it's a lot of time and expense. And by the time you get an issued patent, it's no longer perhaps in the market. Where here, in a space where it moves very quickly, that initial leg up in the market can do wonders for establishing yourself as a market player before anyone else can catch up. Oh, and then one last thing is just what I do hear from researchers sometimes is that they want to limit the scope of the end users and who gets access, because the reputation and integrity of their code is incredibly important to them. They don't want it either to be released and then become buggy and have issues, and then that sort of reflects back on their reputation, or it's of a dual use or sensitive nature. I think we referenced COVID earlier. You know, maybe it's a technology that needs to be handled carefully and it requires some handoff to the next person, that it can't just be thrown into open source and hope that the next person knows how to use it properly. There's probably a little bit, some additional materials that accompanies that software code. So it ends up being more of a bundle of software code, some protocols, materials, instructions, and just having access to the researcher on campus to ask those questions. So just to get buy-in, why might you want to do a license? Here are a few reasons. And Dina, Joel, and I sat down and said, like, we're seeing all these different use cases come in. How can we categorize them? Because this is taking a lot of time and it has to pass a lot of people's hands, which always delays things, to figure out what type of license agreement does it need to go under? Does it all of them need to be under a full agreement where it's 15 pages and it has every T crossed and I dotted, or can it move down the line a little bit, all the way even down to perhaps wrappers, a one-page express agreement, the click wrap, where it's a one-page express agreement, I did it again, where you sign at the bottom and there isn't a negotiation, where express is maybe it's expressed because some of the terms are not negotiated, but yet it has a little bit more detail than your click wrap because it allows perhaps for some negotiation. And then going way again back to the full is where you have your traditional license agreement. Also, what's challenging about copyright? Oh, do you have a question, Dina?
There was a question and I thought it made sense to address it right now as you're talking about these different options about the ballpark costs for each of them. Angie, if you'd prefer, Joel or I could take that.
Please do, Dina.
Yeah, so the fun and the challenge of university technology licensing is that there is no one size fits all. We do try to come up with sort of consistent ways of consideration models, as Angie will talk about in the on this slide, but there's just no easy way to say this is the right price, this is the exact price for this because every situation is different. And if you have a specific situation that you'd like to discuss with us, we're happy to do so once we look at the different aspects of the situation.
And just to dovetail off of that, I'll just stay in this slide for a moment. We've really also thought about what kind of technologies are we also receiving? Are they ones that we can track in the marketplace where they're selling a product and we can say, yes, that product was used creating our software using our technology, and that would be some of the red. And then that breaks up too. Do we want to receive most of our consideration up front because they're going to be exhausting our technology at the beginning of their development cycle? Or can we afford to wait until they're successful? And that would be the outer circle of the ring, where we can wait for a success fee or a royalty tail beyond our patents, perhaps. So that would be the transparent model, where we can really track whether they're using it. Where with machine learning and a lot of other technologies, it's much more difficult. We're going to be a piece of the bigger pie, and it's not going to be entirely clear whether how important our software will be or our technology will be to the overall public or market offering by the company. And that's what I call the black box model, and where you have to look for the type of consideration that you will still receive something regardless of whether you can point to a product in the marketplace. So, you know, equity, maybe even that equity steps up over time. Maybe you don't give us 5% equity the first day, you give us 0.5%. And then with each year that passes, you give us another 0.5%, so long as you're using our software. You know, we're trying to be very creative here and think of ways that we can enable the software, because ultimately we want it to get out to the companies. We want it to be used. So what can we do? How can we be creative to enable that? And then just stepping back real quick on these, you know, I was talking to one of my colleagues at Duke who does a lot of software licensing, and he and I, like, it was so great to talk with him, because he said the same thing to me. It's like, there's just so many different models. Like, it just so depends. We're all used to the traditional patent license where we use it for everything. We have one template. And in fact, our template probably looks a lot like every other template at most universities. They're structured very much the same way. Software isn't, you're not so lucky. You know, you really have to mold it based on what the use is. Is it going to be an end user license? Are they selling products? Are they going to be using it internally for services? Maybe it's a research tool used only internally, and we won't be able to track infringement. So there's all of these factors that just make it a more, initially, a time-consuming practice to get it out the door. But as I was saying before, Dina, Joel, and I brainstormed, and we kind of came up with these 3 different versions, and then have come up with tools behind it so we can go really quickly to make a decision. Okay, do we have copyright only, or is it copyright and patent? Okay, it's going to be very difficult to move to a click wrap if we have a patent rights involved. But if we don't, you know, how valuable is this technology? Can we still send it out with a click wrap and be sufficiently protected? And we have templates for all of these that we can then manipulate. You know, similar to, I think someone had asked, can the open source like license language that we came up with, which, although Joel said it's based on BSD, really it's just very standard, and what researchers are used to seeing, whether it's BSD or MIT. We really tried to keep it so that it looked like every other license that researchers are generally using. But coming back to, you can use that core of that language and then modify it here and there to get it out faster. That's much easier than starting from scratch. Or what most of the time happens, we can't, you know, what used to happen at least was there wasn't a solution. The researcher just sent it out in open source and forgot about it. And then it ends up not being able to kind of retain all of those rights that they were hoping to. So all of these are just tools to get to that next step more quickly, and then out the door. You know, our intent is to become more flexible and to be able to react more quickly. So that's what these models are for. And again, behind each of these, we have templates that are ready to go and to be used. And here, I just wanted to emphasize, like, when you say a software invention, I think everyone thinks about something different. And it's incredible, the diversity of disclosures we receive. But I wanted to just step through your typical categories where you have at the top, this is the microscope I mentioned, where he's able to remove a couple of pieces of the microscope to make it more portable, cheaper, faster, easier to use, and then use the software to improve the image to make it look just like an image that you would receive from a full-scale large microscope that you wouldn't be able to become portable. So it's often something like this, and we have to have our licensing officers ready and capable of identifying, oh, there's a software component here. Let me ask about that. Let me get disclosure of that software, because the company is going to want it. And we're finding more and more it's crucial to the company. They're like, actually, we do want that software. We used to hear, for 5, 10 years ago, you know what, keep your software. We really don't want to taint our libraries with it or our business with it. But more and more companies are becoming comfortable with bringing code in, doing the diligence required, because they recognize there's value there. And then the second example is this chatter baby. It's copyright only, and one of our researchers collected a bunch of baby cries. And maybe, Joel, do you want to explain that technology? That might be a great one for you to talk about just briefly.
Sure. Chatter Baby is a technology that was trained on a large corpus of infant cries that have been annotated so that it can answer the parent's question of, why is my baby crying? It'll basically listen to an infant cry and categorize it and tell you whether the baby is hungry or fussy or in pain or a few other states.
And she's moving on to other categories as well. I mean, not to talk too much about Chatter Baby, but it's things that we need to be mindful when we're licensing. What other verticals might she go into? Could this same software be used for a diagnosis if I know she was looking at colic? You know, there's different verticals that it can move into, and being strategic with your licensing practices, you can retain those rights when you're out licensing for your researcher, so that, and the company doesn't care either, who's not commercializing, let's say, in a colic diagnostic, in grabbing that market. So it's being more strategic and thinking about how can I out license this so I only give out what I need to and what they want, and then retain rights. Go ahead, Dina.
I just wanted to clarify for our audience, because we continue to get comments about the open source license versus these other licenses that we're proposing to use. We are not calling those licenses open source licenses. If you're looking for an open source license, UCLA TDG endorses the use of the BSD license. Those of you who've pointed this out, you are absolutely correct. Once you change those, they're not open source licenses, and they're not sort of the approved one. I'm sorry we're causing any confusion over that. I wanted to just clarify that immediately right now. It either has to be open source. We're just proposing some alternatives when it's appropriate to use something that is not open source. And again, we're happy to talk some more about this at the end, but I wanted to make sure you all understand we're not trying to bastardize open source licensing at all. Thank you.
And also with that, just to note that I should have said this is nothing original. So there are a couple other universities that have used this model and have had it on their website for posting. I won't get into who that is, but it's not the first time that this has been raised. It's just we're putting a push out for it for ourselves. Again, in limited cases, this isn't intended to, as Dina said, replace it, or for publishing. We're not looking for you to use this for your publishing requirements. Stick with what will get you published. We are not trying to slow that down, but we do get requests from researchers all the time asking for something other than open source because they want to make sure they can still patent their technology. And I can't say, yeah, go ahead and use open source and you can be in the clear, but yet they want something. And so we had to come up with a solution that would also work with them, because when I also sent them my 2-page agreement, my 2 to 5 page agreement for them to transfer it, they kind of hang up and be like, oh my gosh, no. You know, I'm not going to send somebody a 5-page agreement and have them run it through their legal. So this is our solution in between, just to help our researchers pass around their software more easily. That's all it is intended. And then finally, the CPR at the bottom here, the calibrated peer review. It's one of our more popular software disclosures as well that we've received over the years, and here's an example where the software is kept proprietary by the researcher, put up on a cloud, and the end users submit their documents. This is for enabling teachers to review their papers more quickly and to make sure that they haven't been copied from, there isn't copyright infringement occurring. Well, they upload their papers and then they get back a report, so they never get access to the software code. So just wanted to quickly give you 3 cases. And then we talked about the consideration models. And this is just generally how we think about it when we get a disclosure in that has commercial interest. And then finally, just not going to step through these, but some policies. And copyright and software, it's complicated. That said, we're here as a resource, and we have those email addresses here again. Please reach out to us. Joel and I are the faces behind these email addresses, as Dina pointed out. I'm the copyright. Joel is, for those that are software centric, reach out to Joel at the software TDG at tdg.ucla.edu.
Thank you, Angie. I'd like to hit a few more questions, but before I do, I think it's worth mentioning how we're handling the COVID pledge that we've signed on to. Do you mind giving an overview of that?
Sure. So the UCLA signed on to the autumn version of the COVID pledge. There's a number of them out there, and we looked at all of them and decided, let's support the group that supports us and that represents us most frequently, which is, again, Association of University Technology Managers, Autumn. And we use that pledge, and we've used it actually for code, in fact. It was the type where we don't have to send the code, but it was important. It's COVID related for tracking. And we came up with a simple, I think it's it's not 2, maybe 2 pages, but it was a simple agreement, non-exclusive, royalty free. Just make sure you use the code use the program in this particular way, report your data in this way. Maybe we have indemnification protections because it's particularly important involving healthcare related matters. So that's one test case. And I know, Dina, your group also had another one where it was a COVID related technology for some sort of, can't recall offhand, but we also came up with a royalty-free, time-limited duration for that technology. And similarly, then would renegotiate at the time the COVID is over and no longer royalty-free license makes sense. And at the same time, the company is able to develop the technology during that time frame. So by the time we come back to negotiate, we can discuss appropriate consideration coming back to the university. But importantly, it's always good to talk to your researchers involved too, to make sure they're all on board. It's something that we do with some vetting, but it's something we support very much.
Thank you for that overview. And we'll address a few more questions at the end, but I also wanted to just say at this point, thank you all very much for joining us. As I said, we definitely want feedback. We really appreciate all the questions that you've shared with us so far. And as Angie mentioned, we're always available at those email addresses, and then as well through TDG's website.